In 2003, in a university lecture hall in Tempe, Arizona, a woman named Carletta Tilousi sat in the audience and listened to a graduate student explain where her people came from. She had walked out of a village on the floor of the Grand Canyon to get there. Fewer than 700 people live in that village. It can be reached only by an 8-mile trail, and the mail still arrives by mule. The student was describing a migration across the Bering Strait. The Havasupai say they began in the canyon itself, and the evidence being presented against them had been drawn from their own blood 13 years earlier for a completely different reason. For more than a century, the history of the American Southwest was written by people who never asked the people living in it. What happened in that room ended in a courtroom. To understand what was taken, you have to understand what was given and why it was given freely. Supai sits at the bottom of the Grand Canyon in a side canyon carved by Havasu Creek, roughly 2,000 feet below the rim. There is no road into it. There has never been a road into it. Everything that enters the village arrives on foot, on horseback, by mule train, or by helicopter, and everything that leaves does the same. It is the most remote, permanently inhabited community in the lower 48 states, and the United States Postal Service still delivers its mail by pack animal, which makes it the last place in the country where that is true. The Havasupai have lived in and around that canyon for a very long time, and their own account of their history places their origin there, not near there. There. The canyon is not the landscape they migrated into. It is the place they began. By the 1980s, the tribe was facing something it could not solve on its own. Diabetes had moved through the community at a rate that is difficult to describe without sounding like exaggeration. More than half the adult population was affected. In a tribe with fewer than 700 enrolled members, that is not a public health statistic. That is most of the people you know, most of the people you are related to, and in many households, every adult in the building. There was no obvious explanation. The community had been eating a traditional diet within living memory. Something had changed, and nobody could say what. So, in 1989, the tribe went looking for help, and the help came from Arizona State University. Two researchers, John Martin, an anthropologist who had worked with the Havasupai for years and was trusted in the village, and Teres Markow, a geneticist, set up what became known as the Havasupai Diabetes Project. The proposal was straightforward. Members of the tribe would give blood. The blood would be analyzed for genetic markers associated with type 2 diabetes. If a genetic contribution existed, it might point toward treatment or at least toward an explanation. Between 1990 and 1994, roughly 400 members of the tribe gave samples. Consider what that number means in a community of that size. This was not a research cohort assembled from volunteers across a city. This was more than half of everyone. Entire families, elders and teenagers in the same afternoon. People queued in the village and in the clinic and rolled up a sleeve because the alternative was watching the disease keep moving. And blood is not a neutral substance in Havasupai culture. It carries spiritual weight. Giving it is not equivalent to filling in a questionnaire, and the people who gave it understood exactly what they were handing over. They did it anyway, because they had been told the research might produce a cure, and because a man they trusted was asking. What they signed was a single page. The relevant sentence stated that the purpose of the research was to study the causes of behavioral and medical disorders. 12 words. Everything that follows in this story turns on them. Read one way, that sentence describes a diabetes study, which is what was explained in the village, in plain language, by the people collecting the samples. Read another way, it is broad enough to authorize almost any research into almost any human condition, indefinitely, on material that had already left the canyon. Which of those two readings the tribe consented to has never been settled by a court, and both sides have maintained their position for more than 20 years. In 1991, the first paper appeared. It reported that no genetic basis for the elevated diabetes rates had been identified in the Havasupai samples. The answer was no. There was no gene to find, or at least none that the methods of that decade could see. For the tribe, that was the end of it. A question had been asked, The answer had come back negative, and the matter was closed. The people who had given blood went back to their lives, and the epidemic continued, and nobody in Supai thought about the project again for the better part of a decade. The study the Havasupai agreed to was finished in 1991. The samples were not. They were still in freezers in Tempe, and over the next 12 years they would be used again and again for questions nobody in the canyon had been asked and nobody in the canyon would have permitted. The person who found out was not a scientist, and she found out by accident. Carletta Tilousi was a Havasupai tribal councilwoman and, in 2003, a student herself. She was invited to a doctoral presentation at Arizona State University. She went because it seemed like the kind of thing a councilwoman should attend. What she heard was a graduate student presenting a dissertation on the origins of her own people, arguing that the Havasupai had arrived in North America across the Bering land bridge. She asked a single question from the audience. Had that research used Havasupai blood? It had. Understand why that specific finding was not an academic disagreement. The Havasupai account of themselves places their beginning in the Grand Canyon. It is not a metaphor, and it is not a creation myth held at arm's length. It is the tribe's history of itself, the basis of its claim to the land it lives on, and the answer given to children when they ask where they come from. What Tilousi sat and listened to was a scientific argument against that history, built from blood her relatives had donated to fight a disease. She went back to the village, and the tribe began asking what else the samples had been used for. The answer took time to assemble because nobody had been told and no one volunteered it. What eventually emerged was that the Havasupai blood collected for the diabetes project had been used in research on schizophrenia, on population inbreeding, and on human migration. Samples had also been shared with researchers at other institutions. Dissertations had been written, papers had been published. Roughly 24 articles in total drew on that material across more than a decade, and not one of them concerned diabetes. Each of those 3 subjects lands differently, and each lands hard. Schizophrenia is heavily stigmatized in Havasupai culture to the point that discussing it publicly is close to taboo. A published finding linking the tribe to a mental illness in a community of 600 or 700 people where everyone is identifiable is not an abstract result. Inbreeding is worse. In a population that small, a study of consanguinity is not a statistical exercise. It is a statement about specific families, and everyone in the village can work out which ones. And migration, as Tilousi had just discovered in that lecture hall, contradicted the tribe's account of its own origin. In 2004, the Havasupai filed suit against the Arizona Board of Regents and the researchers on the grounds that the additional studies exceeded the consent that had been given and that the tribe had never been informed. The defense has never conceded the central point, and it deserves stating properly. Therese Markow has maintained publicly for more than 20 years that the consent obtained covered broader genetic research, that the language on the form was deliberately general because that is how such research works, and that the characterization of what was done with the samples has been distorted in the retelling. She has disputed the account of the schizophrenia work specifically. She has never accepted that anything improper occurred. That dispute was never resolved because the case never reached a verdict on it. A federal judge dismissed most of the claims on procedural grounds. What remained was settled out of court. In April of 2010, the Arizona Board of Regents agreed to pay $700,000, divided among 41 tribal members. The blood samples were returned to the tribe. The university agreed to additional assistance, including scholarships and support for a clinic and a school. $700,000 is roughly 1/100th of what the tribe had originally sought. And here's the part that matters more than the money. The settlement established nothing. Because the case was settled rather than decided, it produced no ruling, no precedent, and no binding standard that any other researcher anywhere is obliged to follow. Legal scholars have pointed out that a case now taught in every bioethics course in the country technically changed no law at all. What it changed was informal, and it changed it permanently. Institutional review boards across the United States began asking questions they had not previously thought to ask. And in the Southwest specifically, tribal nations drew a conclusion that has held for 15 years and shows no sign of loosening. Blood leaves the community and does not come back under the community's control. The samples went home to the canyon. The question of who is allowed to take them and what they may be used for once taken went unanswered. 500 kilometers east, in a canyon in New Mexico, it was about to be asked again, using bones that had been out of the ground for 100 years. Chaco Canyon is a shallow cut of sandstone in northwestern New Mexico, about 15 kilometers long, surrounded by high desert in every direction. There is no river worth the name. There is no fertile valley. The water table is deep, the growing season is short, and the nearest useful timber stands in mountain ranges 80 kilometers away. Between roughly 800 and 1130, something in that canyon organized the largest construction project anywhere north of Mexico. Pueblo Bonito is the largest of the great houses, a masonry complex that rose to 5 stories and contained around 650 rooms. More than a dozen structures like it stand within the canyon, with scores of outlying settlements built in the same style across the wider region, some of them linked by engineered roads that run in straight lines across terrain rather than around it. 200,000 timbers were carried in on foot from those distant mountains, without draft animals and without the wheel. That is the puzzle, and for most of a century it had no solution. Enormous coordinated effort in a place that could barely feed anyone, with no way to tell who was directing it. Because there is no writing, no inscriptions, no records, no king lists. Chaco has been argued about for 100 years, and the interpretations have ranged from a fully egalitarian society with no leaders whatsoever, to a ceremonial center run by rotating priesthoods, to something approaching a state. Every one of those readings was constructed from architecture and pottery, because architecture and pottery were the only evidence anyone had. Then there was Room 33. In the 1890s, an expedition sponsored by the American Museum of Natural History excavated a small chamber inside Pueblo Bonito, roughly 2 meters square, buried within the oldest section of the building. It contained 14 burials. It also contained one of the richest collections of grave goods ever recovered in North America, roughly 50,000 objects, including turquoise by the tens of thousands of pieces, shell trumpets from the Pacific coast, and ceremonial staffs. 2 of the individuals had been interred beneath a wooden plank floor, with the others laid above them over the following centuries. Nobody doubted that these were high-status people. What nobody could establish was whether status in Chaco was inherited or earned or held for a single lifetime and then passed to someone unrelated. Grave goods tell you a person mattered. They do not tell you why. The remains sat in museum drawers in New York for well over 100 years. In 2017, a team led by Douglas Kennett, then at Penn State, and Stephen Plogg at the University of Virginia, published the result of applying 2 methods to that material at once. They directly radiocarbon dated 11 of the burials, which established the sequence in which the bodies had been placed, and they extracted mitochondrial DNA from 9 of them. Mitochondrial DNA is the useful part here, and the mechanism is simple. It passes only from a mother to her children. A father contributes none of it. So 2 people sharing an identical mitochondrial genome share an unbroken chain of mothers, and no amount of intermarriage or adoption or political alliance can produce that signal by accident. All 9 were identical. Kennett's first assumption was that something had gone wrong in the laboratory. Contamination is the standard explanation when ancient DNA results look too clean, and he checked for it. There was none. The samples were then run independently in David Reich's laboratory at Harvard, which produced the same answer. Set that against the radiocarbon sequence, and the picture is unambiguous. One maternal line held the most elaborate burial crypt in the Pueblo world for roughly 330 years, from around 800 until the canyon emptied. 9 generations placed one after another into the same 2-meter room, in the oldest part of the largest building, across the entire span of Chaco's rise and collapse. Plogg put it plainly. For the first time, they could say that one kinship group controlled Pueblo Bonito for more than 3 centuries, and that it was the best evidence of social hierarchy anyone had produced for the ancient Southwest. Kennett was careful about what it did not show. This was not a state. Nobody was claiming a kingdom or an empire. But the egalitarian reading, the leaderless conglomeration of farmers that had appeared in textbooks for decades, could not survive it. It was a genuine discovery, arrived at rigorously, and confirmed by an independent laboratory. The people whose ancestors were in that room found out when they read about it. The law that was supposed to prevent that is called NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990. It requires any museum holding Native American human remains to inventory them and determine whether they are culturally affiliated with a living tribe. If they are, the tribe must be consulted and can request their return. The mechanism turns entirely on that one word: affiliated. In its review during the 1990s, the American Museum of Natural History did not affiliate the Room 33 remains with any tribe. They were classified as culturally unaffiliated. Under the statute, that classification meant no tribal consultation was legally required before research, and no tribe had standing to object to it. When the DNA work began 2 decades later, the researchers were not breaking any law. They were operating inside a determination that had been made about those individuals long before by the institution holding the boxes. League Kawanwisuma directed the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office from 1989 to 2017, which is to say he held the post across the entire period in question. He learned that Hopi ancestral remains had been genetically sequenced when the study was published. Absolutely no one told him, he said afterwards. The tribe had never given permission or support of any kind. The matter went to the Hopi, to Zuni, to Acoma, to Santa Clara, and to the All Pueblo Council of Governors. Kurt Dongoski, the Zuni Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, identified the structural problem rather than the individual one. Leaving the determination of cultural affiliation to an institution that represents the settler state, he argued, is itself the difficulty. Particularly when much of the collection in question was assembled in the 1890s by that same institution without the consent of anyone. The criticism was not confined to tribal offices. Ruth Van Dyke, a Chaco archaeologist at Binghamton University, said the work was technically legal and the ethics questionable, and that studies using ancient indigenous DNA should not be conducted without tribal consultation. Rebecca Tsosi, a law professor at the University of Arizona specializing in Indian law, agreed and said she was dismayed no effort had been made to engage the descendant communities. A formal response was published in the journal Human Biology by Katrina Claw, Dorothy Lippert, and colleagues, all of them indigenous researchers or allies working in genetics and anthropology. They raised 3 specific objections: the absence of tribal consultation, the use of culturally insensitive language in describing ancestors as specimens, and the potential consequences for living communities of conclusions drawn about their ancestors without their involvement. Consider what that phrase, culturally unaffiliated, was actually asserting. It was not a claim about the past. Pueblo peoples have said for as long as anyone has been asking that Chaco is theirs. Hopi tradition identifies the canyon as Yupkoivi and places specific clans there during the migrations, with named clan histories attached to named locations. Zuni holds a comparable account. The archaeological evidence for continuity between Chaco and the modern pueblos has been considered strong for decades. The determination that these ancestors belonged to nobody was not a finding about who they were related to. It was a decision about which kinds of evidence counted, made by a museum, using a standard the museum itself set. And the proof that it was a decision rather than a fact is that a different institution, looking at material from the same canyon, reached the opposite conclusion. Other Chaco remains, held elsewhere, went through the same process and were determined to be affiliated with more than 20 Pueblo tribes and with the Navajo. The National Park Service made that determination. The Department of the Interior upheld it. In 2006, those ancestors were handed over to tribal representatives and reburied in the canyon, in a location that has not been made public. Same canyon, same period, same people. 2 determinations pointing in opposite directions, and the only variable was who was holding the drawer. None of this was an argument against the science. That distinction gets lost constantly, and it matters enormously. Nobody in those tribal offices disputed the radiocarbon dates or the mitochondrial results. Dongoski has worked in archaeology for his entire career. Havasupai spent 3 decades collaborating with researchers. The objection was to a pattern, and by 2017, the pattern was long established. Blood taken in the Grand Canyon for one purpose and used for another. Ancestors sequenced in New York without a phone call. In both cases, an answer about who these people were produced and published before anyone thought to ask them. Which is why, if you go looking for a genetic study of the Hopi, you will not find one. There is no study. There is no data set. No geneticist has sequenced a Hopi population and reported where the Hopi came from, because the Hopi have declined to participate, and they have declined for the reasons laid out in the last 2 sections. That is not a gap in the research. It is a result of it. And the Hopi position on their own history has never actually depended on genetics. Havasupai spent 30 years documenting it in print, working alongside archaeologists in publications anyone can read. Hopi clan traditions identify Chaco as Yupkoivi and describe specific clans occupying it during the migrations, with particular histories attached to particular places. The claim of descent was made in detail in writing decades before anybody extracted anything from Room 33. What was missing was never the assertion. It was the willingness of the discipline to count it as evidence. That is what a vacuum looks like. And vacuums attract writers. On the 5th of April, 1909, the Arizona Gazette ran a front-page story reporting that a Smithsonian-backed expedition had discovered an enormous cavern complex high in the wall of the Grand Canyon. Inside, according to the article, were carved chambers running more than 1,000 feet into the rock. Preserved mummies seated rather than laid flat, copper weapons, and hieroglyphic tablets. The style of the artifacts, the paper said, pointed to Egypt or the Orient. An explorer named G.E. Kincaid had found it. A Professor S. Jordan of the Smithsonian was leading the excavation. More than a century of investigation has produced the same answer every time it has been asked. The Smithsonian's Department of Anthropology holds no file for a Professor Jordan. It holds no file for G.E. Kincaid, under either spelling. It has no record of any Grand Canyon excavation resembling the one described, no correspondence, no photographs, no artifacts, and no expedition. Journalists, librarians, park staff, and historians have searched the archival record independently, and none has found a trace of either man existing anywhere, in any context. No follow-up article appeared, no scientific report was ever published. And the Gazette referred throughout to the Smithsonian Institute, which is not and has never been the name of the institution, a mistake no one connected to it would make. The story is a newspaper fabrication of a kind that was not unusual in that decade, and it has been identified as such by every serious researcher who has examined it. It is in this video for one reason only. Look at what the fabrication actually does. It takes the deepest canyon in North America, a landscape occupied continuously by identifiable peoples for thousands of years, and hands its ancient history to Egypt. Not to the Havasupai living on the canyon floor, not to the Hopi, whose emergence tradition is bound to that landscape. To a civilization 4,000 miles away that has no connection to it whatsoever. That is the same operation as a doctoral thesis arguing the Havasupai walked in from Siberia. It is the same operation as a determination that ancestors in a New York drawer belong to nobody. Different centuries, different levels of sophistication, entirely different intentions, and one identical effect. In each case, the answer to who these people are and where they came from gets produced by an outsider, and the people themselves are not in the room. A note on the Hopi material that frequently gets attached to this story online, because the attachment is not accurate and it is not respectful. Hopi tradition includes accounts of emergence into the present world and of beings who sheltered the ancestors beneath the earth. These are sacred teachings transmitted through the clan system across generations, and they belong to the Hopi. They are their religious tradition, held as such. And this documentary is not in a position to evaluate them and will not attempt to. What can be said clearly is that they have nothing to do with a newspaper story from 1909, and using them as corroboration for a hoax treats sacred history as raw material for somebody else's mystery. The Hopi themselves asked for restraint. In the year 2000, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office issued a statement concerning sacred locations in the Grand Canyon. It did not endorse any claim and did not dispute any. It asked that certain places not be treated as sites for public investigation. 3 ways of getting the same history wrong: invent it, extract it, or dismiss the people who never stopped telling it. There was one way left to test which of those 3 was the actual problem. In 2025, a pueblo in northern New Mexico ran it. Picuris Pueblo sits in the mountains of northern New Mexico, in the Sangre de Cristo Range above the Rio Grande Valley. It is one of the smallest of the pueblos, with a few hundred enrolled members, and it has been continuously occupied since roughly the year 1200. Its oral history says the people came from Chaco. That claim has been made for as long as anyone outside has been listening, and for most of that time it went the way such claims usually went. It was recorded as tradition. It was filed as belief. It was set beside the archaeological literature rather than inside it. And the distance between Picuris and Chaco, 275 kilometers of high desert and mountain, was treated as a reason for caution rather than a route. In 2025, the tribe decided to test it. The direction of that decision is the entire point of this section. Picuris approached the geneticists, not the reverse. The tribal government initiated the study, defined what it wanted to know, and retained control over the data throughout. The Picuris were not a research population. They were the client, and then they were co-authors. The work was led on the scientific side by researchers including Tomás Pinotti and Eske Willerslev, working with the tribe over several years. The tribal leadership, including Governor Craig Quancello and Wayne Yaza, were named authors on the resulting paper. It is the first time a federally recognized tribe in the United States has led and co-authored a genomic study of its own ancestry. The material came from 2 places: 16 individuals excavated at Picuris itself, dating from between 1300 and 1500, whose remains the tribe already held and controlled, and 13 living members of the Pueblo who volunteered. Together they produced genomic data spanning the last 1,000 years of a single community. The results appeared in Nature on April 30th, 2025. The ancient Picuris and the living Picuris form a single continuous genetic cluster. The people buried in the Pueblo 700 years ago are the direct ancestors of the people living in it now, with no break, no replacement, and no significant discontinuity across the entire span. And that cluster ties more closely to the ancestral Puebloan individuals from Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon than to any other sampled group on the continent, including through the maternal lines. The comparison data used to establish that connection was the Room 33 material. The same 9 mitochondrial genomes, extracted in 2017 without anyone asking, became in 2025 the reference point a tribe used to demonstrate its own account of itself. Same bones, same method, same laboratory technique. The only variable that changed was who was asking the question, and the answer came back on the side of the oral tradition. 2 further findings came with it, and both break older models. There is no evidence of population decline in the Picuris lineage before European arrival. The long-standing narrative of a southwest emptying out and collapsing on its own, before contact, does not appear in the genomes of the people who were there. And there is no Athabascan ancestry in any individual predating 1500, which constrains the timing of Navajo and Apache arrival in the region and challenges several migration hypotheses that had been built without any genetic data at all. Governor Yaza described the result as being about their story, their identity, and their right to be heard rather than about genetics as such. The published paper says the same thing in the language of a scientific article. It states explicitly that the work prioritizes indigenous control of genetic data and that it brings together oral tradition, archaeology, ethnography, and genetics as a single body of evidence rather than as competing accounts. One limit needs stating plainly, because the temptation to overread this is enormous. This is Picuris. It establishes the ancestry of one pueblo and its connection to one site. It does not speak for the Hopi or the Zuni or the Havasupai, none of whom have run such a study, and none of whom are under the slightest obligation to. A tribe that declines genetic research has not failed to prove anything. It has exercised a decision that the last 30 years gave it every reason to make. What Picuris does establish is narrower and more useful. The method was never the problem. Ancient DNA did not have to be something done to southwestern peoples, producing conclusions they learned about from a journal. Under their own control, aimed at their own question, it returned an answer they had been giving for 800 years. Notice which side of that exchange the DNA actually corrected. Go back to the lecture hall in Tempe, a woman from the floor of the Grand Canyon, listening to a stranger explain her origins, using her own blood as the evidence against her. For a century, the contest was framed the same way: the rigor of the laboratory on one side, the unreliability of memory on the other. Tradition was what you consulted when the science had not arrived yet. Then the science arrived, pointed at the question by the people whose history it was, and agreed with the memory. The oral traditions were never a competing hypothesis waiting to be checked. They were the record. What was missing from the archive was not data. It was permission, and the willingness to ask before extracting. The question was never whether DNA could tell these people who they were. It was why anyone ever thought they needed telling.